Under what kind of circumstances can people vanish without a trace? Flannan Lighthouse is on a small island off the west coast of Scotland. It gained notoriety for the mysterious disappearance of its keepers in 1900. The lighthouse was constructed between 1895 and 1899. The construction materials had to be manually hauled up 148-foot cliffs, after being unloaded from supply boats on the sea below. At the time, it took 20 barrels of paraffin a year to keep the light burning. These supplies had to be painstakingly winched up the tower cliffs on cables. The first sign that something wasn't quite right on the island was on 15th December, 1900. The captain of the steamer Archtor, traveling from Philadelphia to Leith, made a note in his log that the light was out. Weather conditions were not good at the time, and the light most certainly should have been operational. When the ship arrived in Leith on 18th December 1900, the anomaly was reported to the Northern Lighthouse Board. 3 men were responsible for manning the lighthouse: James Decat, Thomas Marshall, and Donald MacArthur. Aware that there might be something wrong, the relief vessel Hesperus was dispatched to check on the lighthouse and its staff. However, bad weather meant the ship did not reach the island until midday on 26th December. Also on board the Hesperus was a relief keeper, with no way of contacting the lighthouse staff. All eventualities had been considered. One of the 3 men might have fallen ill, or worse. Upon arriving at the island, it was discovered that the flagpole wasn't flying its flag. There were also no provision boxes on the landing dock for restocking. Even stranger, none of the lighthouse keepers were waiting to welcome the boat. Their vantage point in the lighthouse meant they could easily see any ships approaching. The captain of the Hesperus blew the ship's whistle and fired a flare, but was unsuccessful in alerting the men in the lighthouse. A rowboat was launched. The relief keeper climbed aboard and ventured on shore alone. Oddly enough, the entrance gate to the compound and the main door of the lighthouse were both closed. He called out, but received no answer. On entering the lighthouse, he discovered it was empty. The beds were left unmade and the clock had stopped. After returning to the landing dock to alert the rest of the crew, he returned to the lighthouse accompanied by the Hesperus's second mate and another crew member. The men searched the lighthouse again. They found that the lamps had been cleaned and refilled. A set of oilskins was found, which was unusual. The environment was harsh and cold. Why would anyone leave the lighthouse without adequate wet weather gear? However, their search turned up nothing. There was no sign of the missing men. They weren't in the lighthouse or anywhere on the tiny island. The would-be rescuers were shocked, but there was nothing more they could do. For crewmen were left on the island to attend to the lighthouse, and the Hesperus returned to port. The captain sent a solemn telegram to the Northern Lighthouse Board. A dreadful accident has happened at the Flannan. The 3 keepers, Decat, Marshall, and the occasional have disappeared from the island. The clocks were stopped and other signs indicate that the accident must have happened about a week ago. Poor fellows, they must have been blown over the cliffs or drowned trying to secure a crane. The men left on the island continue to search for the missing lighthouse keepers. Although it would be horrible to find a body or bodies, at least it would go some way towards solving the enigma. On the west side of the island was undeniable evidence of damage, probably caused by recent storms. A box at 108 feet above sea level had been broken. Iron railings were twisted, and an enormous rock weighing more than a ton had been overturned. Entire lengths of grass and dirt had been ripped away from the cliff edge. One of the men joked nervously that it looked as if a giant hand had reached down and caused havoc. At the end of December, a superintendent from the Northern Lighthouse Board arrived at the island to lead an official investigation into what might have happened to the men. He was startled by the extent of the damage on the west side of the island, exclaiming it was difficult to believe unless it was actually seen. After looking around, he came to the conclusion that the men had gone to the cliff edge to secure some equipment. While they were there, a large wave must have washed over the cliff and tragically washed the men to their deaths. He added that by leaving the lighthouse light unattended they had breached the Northern Lighthouse Board rules. This probably wasn't any comfort to the lighthouse keepers' grieving families. 2 of the missing men had left wives and young children behind. None of the men's bodies were ever found, but the papers at the time had a field day speculating over what might have happened. The public too were more than happy to gossip and spin fantasy scenarios. It was suggested that the men had been taken by a sea serpent, or captured by foreign enemies, or even been spirited away by a ship full of ghosts. Over time a more feasible story developed, and several unusual logbook entries came to light. On 12 December the entry records details of severe winds the likes of which I have never seen before in over 20 years on the island. There are also logbook entries that say one of the men was very quiet, while another had been crying, as the man in question was known to have an aggressive nature and was fond of brawling. The idea of him crying was out of character. Oddly, other entries include comments about the terrible storms and how the men have been praying, but there were no reported storms in the area on those exact days. The men were also experienced lighthouse keepers. They were all very much used to harsh storms. Later, it was stated that the logbook entries were all fictional. However, with the passing of years and with evidence lost, who is to say for sure? Further research has concluded that the men were swept out to sea by huge waves. How this situation came about is purely conjecture at this stage.